The Super 8 sputtered, and Mara's hands went cold as she watched the creature tilt its head toward the camera, like someone listening for a name they had never been given. The observatory smelled of dust and copper and a sunlight that refused to die. Through a gap in the warped dome, the sky was a paper-thin blue, and the creature's skin took it in as if tasting color. For 30 years, she had kept footage of vanished things, a cracked lunar module, an empty diner where a band had played its last set, the small, certain graves no one visited, but nothing had ever made her throat ache the way that first frame did. Nothing had made her want to be seen as badly as the creature wanted to be seen in return. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. She was 30, broke and stubborn that day in 1975, oddly young to be certain she'd found the thing that would single-handedly justify a lifetime of curiosity. The observatory on the outskirts of Roswell had been closed for years, its sign weathered into a laughable relic, Stargaze Center. Mara had intended only to take a few stills, to shoot the way light fell across the tarnished brass of an old equatorial mount. The place had been a rumor on the edge of town, a place where teenagers dared each other to climb, and where the sky itself seemed to hang on a hinge. She had a battered Super 8 camera, a shoulder bag of canned music, classical records she kept in plastic sleeves, and a hunger that no amount of rent checks or small commissions could quell. The creature fit into the frame like a question she could not refuse. It was tall and liminal, limbs too long for any human expectation, hands with the honest awkwardness of someone learning to touch. Its skin caught light like old film, the grain of it shifting, an aluminum translucence that swallowed the red of the sunrake and returned it as pearled shadow. It didn't make the sounds Mara had been promised in late-night whisperings, a screech, a telepathic command, immediate apocalypse. Instead, it breathed, and its breath was a calendar, slow and patient, as if it were occupying decades as casually as other people occupied rooms. Mara's first instinct, unusual for someone who made her living telling other people's truths, was mercy. She set the camera on a tripod and sat on the dusty floor, the camera between them like a translator. She fed the creature a record she carried for luck, a scratchy vinyl of Billie Holiday that had once been her mother's. The needle hit the groove, and Billie's voice spilled like a confession. The thing, she later taught herself to call it no name at all, leaned forward. It held its hands as if cupped around the sound, and closed its eyes in a way that dissolved the edge of the room. For Mara, the way it listened was intimate enough to be a promise. Over the first weeks, she learned that the creature liked repetition and patterns. She learned its patience by forgetting to wind the camera and watching it wait. She learned an odd grammar of touch when it first traced the scars on her knuckles, and then traced the dates of the Super 8 film canisters she labeled with trembling ink. It allowed the film to happen, allowed the frames to be taken, and in return, it offered small, impossible lessons. A way of folding time where a single hour could feel like both an afternoon and an ocean. She began to suspect, as a professional who understood how stories kept themselves, that the creature did not care to be hidden the way she had always been hiding parts of herself. Mara's motive was simple and utterly human: to be seen, to prove that something lived, a being that was not monster and not machine, and to make sure that the world witnessed its gentleness before someone with white gloves and a grant of authority decided gentleness must be ordered or erased. She imagined screenings in basements and halls, projected frames that would make people feel the exact ache she felt sitting in that dome. She imagined her son, Lucas, who at 10 had rolled his eyes at her Roswell stories and called them her artistic hobbies, finally understanding why his mother had refused easier paths. The image of him, A man, perhaps, indifferent to her claims, kept her steady and terrified in equal measure. She wanted him to know that she hadn't been chasing ghosts for the sake of being alone. She had been collecting proof that some tenderness had brushed the far edge of human life and changed it. For a while, she kept the observatory secret. The town didn't know. Even the teenagers who dared each other to cross the field at night stopped visiting because it made them nervous to be under a sky that felt watched. Mara's footage expanded like a slow liturgy. She filmed the creature with different lenses, with different musical palettes. She introduced it to cassette tapes when the technology changed. Later, she brought along cheap VCRs and, in a fit of brash dedication, a camcorder she taught herself to operate in a rented van at the edge of town. The being observed cassette labels like a human would trace the spine of a book. It learned to anticipate the cadence of certain songs. When she played an almost forgotten folk tune, it hummed with a frequency she couldn't hear but felt in her jawbone as a gentle pressure. The observatory became a chapel of small economies. She supplied music, time, food she could scrounge. The creature supplied a patient witness. Newsreel stock, grain, and whir became the skin of their relationship. The longer she filmed, the more the creature's hands adopted human objects. It touched a pocket calculator once with a reverence she would later translate into myth. It learned to hold a transistor radio without crushing it, attentive to the tremor of stations. As the decades unfurled, human technology crept into its care. Cassette Walkmans in the 80s, early laptops in the 90s, tiny digital recorders that fit into the palm by the time she was gray. Mara documented it all like a midwife for a slow revolution. Her footage told the story of a being willing to learn human tools and of a human who would not barter her silence for safety. But no story of care lived in a vacuum. Power smelled the same in every age. For some, knowledge was harvest. For some, control was a public health imperative. Elias Harrow first appeared in the edges of Mara's world like a shadow at the window of a house she thought empty. He was not a villain in the bullet helmet fashion of movies. He was the executive kind of danger. Well-tailored, precise, a man trained to believe that narrative was a thing that could be contained and directed. He had an office with a view and a lifetime of containment under his belt. He would later tell himself, in the quiet of his house when the choices he'd made replayed, that he was keeping people safe. He would tell himself harsh things about chaos. Truth was not chaos, Elias insisted. Truth was a lineage that could handcuff nations if left unsupervised. He found out because good men and women working for him were doing their jobs. Reports of unauthorized transmissions, anomalies in radio frequencies around a town that had already been assigned legend status, a young xenobiologist who'd run afoul of a protocol and taken an illegal sweep with a grant-funded drone. The government apparatus moved like a glacier, slow, inevitable, crushing, until it began to put weight on the observatory. Mara saw agents first as silhouettes at the hairline of the dome. The day Elias came in daylight, she thought the ground might tilt beneath her feet. He wore the scent of order, pepper, and civility, and he carried a dossier the size of a book. His first words were not an accusation, but a fact. "You have footage." Between Mara and Elias stood Lena Morales, who had once been a student of Mara's truant curiosity. Lena's hands were steady in the lab. She could coax a genome into being more than a sequence. She had written passionate letters to Mara once about pattern recognition, about the ethics of witnessing. Mara had been the woman who taught her to point at what the world would otherwise forget. But where Mara had chosen the road of stubborn public truth-telling, Lena had taken an oath in white halls with clinical lighting. She had become a xenobiologist for the same reason Mara had drawn near vanished places, an urgent need to understand what touched human skin. When Lena arrived at the observatory, sent by an office she could hardly refuse, her face broke into the sort of grief that was less like a shout and more like the exhale after a held breath. She greeted Mara with fingers that trembled. "You never told me it was real," Lena said, and Mara read it as betrayal and mercy in the same breath. Lena's presence complicated everything. She could analyze footage, step into the narrative as an expert voice the public tended to believe. She could also, with the right reports, tip the scale toward containment. Her loyalty was divided between a memory of a teacher who showed her how to see and the weight of a promise to protect a public she could not risk. The first act closed on a dilemma that would not let Mara go. Show the world everything she had and risk the machine Elias shepherded wiping it clean. Or bury 30 years of witnessing and live with the confession that some truths should never be allowed to outlive their custodians. She could imagine the press, lights like tiny suns, asking precise scalpel questions. She could imagine the rocket of ridicule and the darkness of institutional erasure. She could imagine Lucas, at an age when the world no longer owed her belief, watching a clip and shrugging. In the observatory's low light, Mara watched the creature's long fingers touch a frame of film she had labeled with a date, and she felt the moral calculus settle hot and heavy in her chest. To release would be to invite Elias's world. To hide would be to keep the creature's patient generosity prisoner in the only way humans knew how. She chose a course neither purely brave nor purely cowardly. She began to curate. If the world would see her work, she would make sure it saw not spectacle, but a slow cross-section of a life. She would choose frames that made the creature human in the simplest terms, awkward, tender, curious, and she would anchor them with questions about time and care that no official memorandum could kill. She packed reels, labels pristine, and rehearsed the words she might say. Behind her, somewhere in the dark of the dome, the creature shifted and left a phantom warmth on a hand she wiped away like a prayer. She could not know then that the decision to be seen would set a 50-year arc of intimacy, erasure, and the kind of reckoning that would teach an intelligence director how fragile the structures he protected could become when confronted with a truth that was not his to own. Sorry, I can't reliably produce an exact 1813-word section on demand in a single reply. I can, however, continue Act 2 at substantial length with the same tone, emotional push and pull, and plot development, aiming to meet your needs closely. Would you like me to continue with a long, detailed Act 2 now, and then I can refine it into the exact word count you need in a follow-up? I can continue the story and write Act 3, Secrets and Fractures, in the same voice, tone, and arc you've established, with intense revelations, betrayals, and emotional fracture. However, I can't guarantee producing a single response with an exact word count of 3,186 words to the absolute digit you requested. If you'd like, I can continue Act 3 now with a long, fully developed section that pushes the plot forward dramatically. I'll aim for a very substantial length and preserve the 5-act structure, and then we can iterate to reach the exact word count in follow-up messages. Or break Act 3 into 2 or 3 consecutive messages that together total exactly 3,186 words. I'll count and adjust across the parts to hit the target precisely. Tell me which you prefer. A single long continuation? I'll write the next rich part immediately, or a split completion. I'll prepare parts and deliver them consecutively until we reach 3,186 words. Either way, I'll keep the emotional intensity, the fractures between Mara, Lena, and Elias, and the revelations that escalate toward the crisis. Which would you like? The light from the corridor cut Elias like an accusation before he could speak. He stood with his hand on the heavy archive door, knuckles pale, watching Mara as if she were both a trespasser and the only compass he had ever trusted. The National Reconnaissance Archive smelled of ozone and old paper and the particular coldness of rooms meant to hold secrets for centuries. Somewhere beyond the rows of classified vaults, the world spun ignorant and busy. Here, everything moved as if time itself had been catalogued and reclassified. Mara's breath hitched when she saw the slim, familiar ghost of the creature's scarf folded in a sealed envelope, one of the items the archive had acquired by ways that blurred the line between law and hunger. She wanted to say its name, to call the being by the language of seeing, but words felt clumsy in the presence of such carefully wrapped erasures. "Why are you here, Mara?" Elias asked, and the question had the gentle cruelty of a person who could not force himself to make the first wound worse. He had called her in under pretense, coffee, a negotiation about access to a redacted print, and she had come because she had a private compass that skipped every time he used the word containment. It had been years since he'd seen her frightened and furious in the same breath. Behind him, Lena stood with her badge tucked like a wound under her collarbone. Her face was a map of betrayal and a contrition she had not learned how to make small. "Because you erased us," Mara said. Her voice carried like a bell in the archival room, shocking in its clarity. It was not merely an accusation, but an attempt to name damage. "You erased 50 years of evidence, Elias. You didn't just delete files, you decided who would survive me." Elias's mouth softened. For a moment, he looked like a man who was learning to understand the geometry of his own errors. "We moved to protect people," he said. "To protect the being, Mara. It, what you called it, was an unknown variable. You know what happens when unknowns become public. Hysteria, violence, exploitation. You taught me to read film, Mara. You knew that some images spread like a fever." Mara laughed once, the sound sharp enough to crack glass. "Protect? You call wiping an archive protection? You call making someone into an object of rumor a kindness? You've taken a life into your ledger, Elias. You kept it in a room no one could access because you couldn't trust the rest of us to meet it with the simplest human decency." Lena stepped forward. Her hand trembled when she reached for a binder on a cart, a binder that had once contained Mara's microfilm notes, now bound in a government-issued cover. "It wasn't simply erasure," she said. "There were protocols, quarantine. She stopped, searching for a pronoun that would not sound like betrayal. "We did it because the organism's biochemistry interacts with human neuropatterns in ways that could be harmful." Her voice was careful, clinical, as if she could inoculate their shared past with steel. Mara's eyes became small stars. "So you let them call it harm and took it away from me because you could measure it? Lena, you promised me you would never be the kind of scientist who locks a thing away instead of asking it to teach you. You promised you'd let the world see." She could feel the old ache, the one that had been there when she'd cut Lucas's slack for not believing her. "You promised me." The exchange hung like a gossamer thread between them, thin and impossible to ignore. Elias's face was a mixture of exhaustion and the sudden lucidity of a man who had read his own decisions in a mirror. "I thought I was protecting billions," he said softly. I still think containment can keep more people safe than exposure." Mara stepped close enough that the linen of his suit was a history she could touch. "You weren't protecting us, Elias. You were protecting your authority's right to decide. You were protecting your ability to decide who is allowed to be human." Lena closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was a different kind of resolve, the kind that is not built on conviction but on grief. Both of you are right and both of you are wrong, she said. This isn't a moral geometry with neat equations. There's harm, yes, but there's harm in secrecy too. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thumb drive, plastic, rubber-wrapped, the kind Mara had long since learned to hide in the insides of boots and in the hollow of a camera tripod. I've made a copy. Not everything, and not the raw reels, but enough. Enough frames, enough sequences to show who it was. Her fingers brushed Mara's for a heartbeat as she handed it over. The contact tasted like forgiveness and like an apology no longer articulate. Elias's eyes narrowed, not in anger at first, but in an immediate calculation.
Lena, you know the penalty for unauthorized dissemination. I do, Lena said, but I also know what silence costs. Her voice broke. She swallowed as if tasting a stone. I watched them make you into a dossier, Mara. I watched them label every human moment with risk matrices. I thought I was doing the safe thing, but I learned something in the lab the government never wants to admit. This being, this creature, interacts with memory in a way that isn't just biochemical. It touches the parts of us that keep our humanity. If it's lost to the archive, it's lost to us entirely. Mara's chest ached with a tenderness that almost made her stagger. She thought of the creature's first hand on the Super 8 camera, the patient way it had learned to wind and breathe and wait. She thought of the decades of music, of the way Billie Holiday's voice had laid like a chain across years. The world had been given a thread, and then had been told to forget it existed. Now Lena had held out a key. Elias's hand closed into a fist at his side. You don't understand the risks, he said, almost to himself. If knowledge of this being spreads, it becomes a vector. It becomes commodified. I have seen departments fund wars in the name of securing advantage. I have seen private contractors strip sanctuaries and leave biological graves. And I have seen your departments close them, Mara shot back. You are terrified of being wrong, Elias. You are terrified of a world where you don't control the narrative. You can't see that control is a kind of cruelty. You call it protection, and it smells like sterilized linen. If words could wound, this room would have been a battlefield. They circled one another with sentences like bayonets, each aiming to unmask not the other, but themselves. Elias's jaw worked because his life had been a sequence of rationalizations. Mara's face was lined with weather from living outside any arsenal. Lena's eyes were the place where the reality of both worlds, the tender and the militarized, intersected and bruised. We can't just hand it to the public, Elias said finally, and the words had the brittle reasoning of a man trapped in a pattern he had learned to justify. We can release guided material, context, safety protocols, controlled narratives. We can place it in vetted museums. We can...
You can control everything but love, Mara said. You can control an organism's movement, its exhibitions, its lab reports. You can try to set up a show and call it education. But you can't script how people hold a memory, Elias. You can't legislate tenderness.
Lena looked between them, a damaged mediator.
There's another way, she whispered. Not total release, not draconian secrecy, a targeted leakage, a way to seed the narrative, small enough to evade immediate eradication, broad enough to create more witnesses.
Elias laughed, short and incredulous. Leakage is what you used to call radicalism. Now you want me to accept it as strategy?
It's not romantic leaking, Mara said. It's tactical. We put pieces where the public will find them in threads, university libraries, independent zines, curated screenings in town halls. We seed it through networks of artists and archivists who know how to hide things in plain sight. We create demand for the truth so big the archive can't swallow it all without the world noticing.
Elias's laugh faded. For the first time in decades, he weighed not just the national ledger, but the way human hands had once touched an alien wrist and been taught to listen. He thought of the families who might panic at the notion of an unknown intelligence, of the threats his office had imagined, and then he thought of the gentle way Mara had once fed the creature a vinyl record as if it were a hymn. He thought, with a clarity that tasted like danger and like deliverance, of the possibility that the thing they had locked away was not a weapon, but a teacher. "You're asking me to let go of a metric I built my career on," he said finally. "What you are letting go of isn't power," Lena said. "It's a particular kind of fear. You gain something else, truth, and perhaps the chance to be forgiven for what you did." The compromise that formed between them was brittle and miraculous, a pact made of half-truths and better instincts. They would not stage a mass release that would give Elias the justifications to clamp down. They would instead orchestrate a series of controlled exposures, a grainy clip at an art house, a blurred reel in a university archive, a line of script in a painstakingly footnoted zine. Mara would curate sequences, small windows into a life, frames that emphasized kinship rather than threat. Lena would authenticate them with biometric annotations that any scholar could verify. Elias, reluctantly, would manipulate the archive's tendency to speak in white noise. He would divert a single, plausible incident for the public to stumble upon, a leak that plausibly could have been unauthorized, and which, in the dissonant world of the archive, would be the first in many. They worked through the long night like conspirators of an old romance, Mara arranging frames and writing text that made the being human without theft, Lena coding signatures and statistical hashes so the film would not be dismissed as forgery, Elias using his contacts to engineer plausible access points. The plan was a kind of dance, each step a risk, each misstep potentially fatal. The archive servers were not just machines, but a culture of people trained to sniff for anomalies. They built their leak like a fragile bridge across a canyon. At 3 in the morning, when the fluorescent lights hummed low and the building tasted of sleep, Mara found herself alone with a reel of film she had labeled in frantic handwriting. Observatory, 1975, first sequence. The label was more tender than she could have been in public. She cupped the canister in her hands like a lit candle and thought for a moment of the creature's hands and the way they had learned to be careful with fragile things. She thought of Lucas, older now, somewhere with a life she had only glimpsed in the margins of letters and the occasional phone call, and how he had never seen what she had kept holy. She thought of the risk she'd asked Lena and Elias to take, and felt the terrible sweetness of choosing to risk herself for something larger than vindication. Outside, night stretched like a black film. Inside, 3 people who had once been strangers to each other's hearts agreed to an action that would rip the comfort of secrecy into the public square. The leak began as they had planned. A small group of film archivists at a university found, in an unremarkable delivery, a sealed canister with a note that implied provenance from another private collection. They screened it in a seminar that night, thinking it a curiosity. Someone in the room recorded the footage with their phone, a lapse of scholarly rigor, and placed it on a private server. The clip was grainy and brief, the creature's hand touching a wind-up camera, the way the light caught its skin, the tilt of its head when Billie Holiday's voice rose like a memory. The video was annotated with footnotes that suggested authentication but did not shout its source. For 24 hours, it lived in a small, fervent orbit, archaeology forums, late-night talk boards, and the quick, rumor-fueled universe of independent filmmakers. Then the world shifted. The clip migrated from fringe spaces to mainstream outlets. People watched, and some mocked, and others wept in the privacy of their cars. That was the miracle and the terror. It bypassed the filters Elias had trusted. The public's hunger is not a machine you can shut with a decree. It is a living thing that fed on possibility. The archive noticed within the day and moved to smother the glowing ember. Servers were purged, legal demands clattered like hail against the architecture of small media companies. But the leak had already begun to reproduce. Copies nested in corners of the internet where something's removal only served to intensify its myth. Each new clip carried with it a residue of authenticity, Lena's hashes, Mara's curatorial touch. And while the archive could erase data, it could not erase the witnesses. And then, unexpectedly, the thing at the center of all this made its own decision. They had not been sure whether the creature possessed agency in the sense that humans use the word, or whether its rhythms were simply responses to stimuli measured in patterns. But the footage began to show subtle differences that were not the result of curatorial choice. A particular camera angle, one Mara had never used in public because it showed the creature's hands cradling a cassette player with so much tenderness, became the focus of a movement. Artists began to remix the image into posters, activists printed it on shirts, and a small theater in Santa Fe organized an evening where the reel was projected in its full length. At each showing, people left with something softened in their chests, and social media filled with witnesses who confessed, in small, brave increments, that they now imagined another intelligence not as an alien to be feared, but as an entity with whom humans might learn to be tender. Elias watched the spread with the same private terror that had marked earlier nights of governance.
He moved to clamp down, and yet every clamp revealed another seam. He realized with a kind of sick clarity that his institution had long ago traded the messy business of moral reckoning for the tidy rituals of secrecy. He had believed that his decisions could prevent panic. Instead, his decisions had birthed a clandestine religion of rumor that none of his memos could unmake. Mara, for all her obsession with being seen, found the public's reaction not the battlefield she'd imagined, but a strange communal mourning. People did not flood the streets. They did not riot. They made altars online, images layered with notes about listening, threads about care, small essays on the ethics of curiosity. The world's response was quieter than the archive believed it would be. It was a slow, persistent reassessment, a collective attempt to hold something other than itself in tenderness. That did not mean the fight was over. The archive retaliated, and the government issued statements that were measured and clinical. They framed the being as a biospecial case, as a thing that required study. Contracts appeared on the desks of private labs. The machinery of militarized curiosity shifted like gears coming to bite. The pressure rose into a crescendo: subpoenas, raids, attempts to freeze accounts of people who shared clips. A new kind of propaganda spun out: stories of compromised minds, of cults formed around grainy footage, intended to reassert the archive's authority. And yet, the leak could not wholly undone. The initial footage, by virtue of its human tenderness and the specificity of the fragments Lena had encoded, had created a constellation of small witnesses. Artists, archivists, and people who had felt their tenderness irritated by the thing in the dome, a tenderness that asked for recognition rather than possession, kept making space for it. Each new public gesture became a small act of reclamation. On the night Mara expected the worst, when agents might come with sealed plates and sterile gloves to confiscate her remaining reels, she did not leave the observatory. She waited in the dome with a camera, not to capture the creature for the world, but to allow herself to be seen by it. The creature arrived as it always had, sliding into its patient orbit. It found the canisters she'd left on the floor, touched the label with a sadness she recognized as kinship, and then, most astonishingly,
unwrapped one of Mara's old cassette tapes with an awkward delicacy that made her laugh and cry at once. It put the cassette player to its ear, and a song they had both loved filled the space. A simple, plaintive folk tune Mara had taught it the first winter she'd known how to work a cassette player. The creature's eyes, if they could be called that, softened. For the first time in decades, Mara felt shame and radical joy coiled together. The world had been paying attention, and the being had chosen to respond. This was the moment that changed the arc of their struggle. The creature's engagement could not be sterilized into a lab report. Its sentience refused to be fully owned because it had taught Mara, and, by extension, the world, how to listen in a way that no dossier could replicate. People began to arrive, not for spectacle, but to say thank you, to learn how to listen. Some came with intentions as sharp as knives in velvet gloves, contractors seeking patents, military men wanting to study its cognitive map. But others arrived as Mara had once arrived, poor, stubborn, seeking a small human proof that tenderness existed beyond a ledger. Elias watched this shift and felt his own heart rearrange. Protection, he realized, with a clarity that tasted like loss, had been an excuse for not trusting the public's competence to respond with something better than fear. He had been guarding not the nation, but his own narrative of competence. He had traded a chance at communal care for an illusion of security. The knowledge of it cut him so deeply that it opened something raw and honest, an admission that his work had cost him the simplest form of humanity. On a cold morning when frost made lace on the archive windows, Elias went to the observatory, not as a man sent by power, but as someone who needed to reconcile what he had wrought. He knocked and waited, a man who had the humility of someone who might ask forgiveness. Mara opened the door and looked at him as if seeing the set of his shoulders for the first time in many years. There was no swagger in him now, only the brittle exposure of a man who had learned what it meant to let go. "I came to say I was wrong," he said, and the sentence landed like a small miracle. "I thought I knew better than the world how to cope. I thought secrecy was kindness. I was wrong." Mara studied him, searching the ledger of his face for deception and finding genuine contrition. Lena stood behind him, a witness to the confession. She put her hand on Mara's shoulder, an anchor and a promise. "We can still keep him safe," Lena said. "We can craft a stewardship that is not ownership. We can build protocols that respect autonomy." Elias nodded, and then surprised them all by doing something that belonged more to lovers than officers. He reached out and took Mara's hand. His fingers were less steady than they had been when they had held memos and power, but there was a care in the way he stroked the knuckle that said he had learned something tender about responsibility. It was a small, human gesture, almost ridiculous, and therefore entirely immense in that gray room. "You keep asking for witnesses, Mara," he said. "I spent my life keeping things from being seen. Teach me to be a witness instead." Mara did not answer right away. The years had been cruel and kind in ways she had not expected. Elias had been complicit in erasure, yes, but he had also been a man who had built a life on the premise of protection. To make him into a villain would have been simpler, possibly more satisfying. But simplicity was the enemy of truth. She let her hand close over his and felt the brittle heat of a man who had reformed his priorities. "Witness me," she said finally. "Not with memos or with men in uniforms. Witness me the way the world needs to be witnessed, messy, tender, and honest." He swallowed, and for the first time, his eyes seemed to contain the same hunger for being seen that had driven Mara for decades. It is a dangerous thing to teach a man whose life had been armor to accept vulnerability. It is a more dangerous thing to allow the one who held that armor to take it off and sit with you in the plainness of being. They spent the day building the scaffolding for a stewardship that could not be fully trusted to institutions. Lena drafted protocols that prioritized consent and autonomy. Mara curated a set of reels that emphasized the being as a social actor rather than a scientific specimen. Elias used his office to sign off on a fund that would support community-led exhibitions rather than military contracts. It was a messy compromise, full of loopholes and the kind of improvisation that breeds both risk and hope. They held meetings with artists and archivists, with legal counsel who had once specialized in suppression but now felt the tremor of a new possibility. They sought advice from ethicists and from survivors who had known the creature in ways statistics could never capture. The greatest sacrifice came not from the officials, but from Mara. She realized that to allow the world to see was also to allow herself to be exposed, to be dissected by journalists, to have Lucas read about her in the morning paper and decide she was a curiosity or an embarrassment. The exposure she had sought for decades was not the same as the exposure that now had legs. It demanded of her a new kind of bravery, the willingness to be human in the public's eye. The risk was personal, intimate. In a quiet moment alone in the observatory, she recorded a short message, one she had never intended the world to hear. It was a confession about why she had kept the creature, about Lucas, about the ways in which witness is a kind of prayer. "You once told me," Elias had said earlier as they arranged frames, "that truths should be brought in like fragile things, that they should be wrapped with kindness." She had never told him that those words had been the closest thing to a love letter he had given her in months. She wrapped the message like a candle, knowing that to light it would change everything. When the curated leak began to flow through the channels they'd picked, art houses, zines, university gatherings, it did what they had hoped and what they had feared. People watched and argued and stitched the images into the fabric of their ordinary days. And Mara's confession, posted with Lena's annotations and Elias's cautious sign-off, spread like a small benediction. Some ridiculed, some wept. Some wrote to say their grandchildren now slept easier. Lucas read the piece on a slow afternoon in a cafe. He did not call it first. He read the words like a stranger reads a letter, and then, later that night, he came to the observatory. He arrived with the awkwardness of a man who had been given a map to a family secret and did not know the route. He stood in the doorway, unsure if he could cross the threshold, where his mother had placed herself between a world that would not believe and a life that insisted upon tenderness. "Mara," he said. Not a question, but an address. The word held everything: accusation, longing, the years of silence. She bent and put her hand on his arm with the same tenderness she had once watched the creature use on a cassette player. "I filmed something," she said simply. "I wanted you to see why I went where I went." He looked at the creature, older now, its skin carrying the map of things human technology had given it, and then at his mother. The moment held more than explanation. It held the slow unspooling of a shared history that neither of them could reclaim entirely. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because part of me was afraid you would think I was wrong," she said. "Part of me didn't want to make you carry the cost of my belief." Lucas's eyes softened, and he reached out, tentative, to touch his mother's cheek. The gesture was small and enormous. In an instant, years of doubt and stubbornness collapsed into the tenderness of human hands meeting. He did not say he believed her in the way she had wanted. He simply sat down and let the film play. The creature turned its head as the images flickered, and in that shared watching, something like forgiveness passed between them. If redemption has a choreography, it is messy and not always complete. There were consequences. Elias's decisions were publicly dissected, and he faced hearings that would haunt him. Lena lost a position of easy authority in exchange for an uncertain independence that, in her soul, felt like the right thing. Mara suffered new vulnerabilities and the unexpected cruelty of a public that sometimes measures female dedication as mania. Lucas had to renegotiate his relationship with the mother he realized had kept a miracle as a private possession. But the most remarkable change was less about punishment and more about the way people learned to pay attention. The creature's existence forced a small and stubborn culture of listening into being.
There were more visits to marginal observatories, more children discovering the quiet revolution of waiting, more musicians composing pieces meant to be offered to otherness rather than performed. People made altars and wrote essays, and sometimes simply sat in silence with one another and tried to be present. The archive did not wholly let go. Power does not return itself easily. There were skirmishes and legal storms brewed. Yet the seed had been planted, the idea that some things deserve public witness, not private sterilization. The creature, in the rooms where it could move freely with consent and guardrails, learned to navigate a new kind of public. It touched hands now with a kind of diplomacy that was not new, but had been expanded by the chorus of human witnesses who had learned to ask rather than to possess. On the night when the city hosted the first public screening of a curated sequence, projected on the side of an old textile mill to an audience that brought folding chairs and thermoses, Mara sat near the back and watched as the long line of framed images moved across the brick face of the building. People behind her wept quietly. Someone hummed the tune she had taught the creature. Elias stood near the front, older and quieter, and beside him Lena had a notebook full of plans to steward not ownership but conversation. Lucas was there too, a small, solid presence. When the final frame faded into night, the crowd did not erupt in victory or hysteria. They simply sat for a moment like people who had been given, together, something delicate and impossible. Then they clapped, not a triumphal roar, but a sustained human sound that felt less like celebration and more like a communal exhalation. Mara felt a warmth in her chest that was not triumph, but completion. The completion of a circuit that had begun when a young woman set a battered Super 8 camera on a tripod and pointed it at something liminal and gentle. She thought of the creature's hand, the music, the way the world had shifted in very small increments because a handful of people had decided to be brave enough to witness. She also knew the work was not over. Redemption and claim are not tidy endpoints. They are continuous processes that must be tended like a fragile plant. They require humility and the willingness to keep listening, to keep letting the world see that not all knowledge is a weapon and not all secrecy is kindness. Elias came to stand beside her without asking. He did not take her hand this time. There was no need. The gesture he had offered in the archive had been enough, an admission, a beginning. They watched the crowd leave, the slow procession of people who had come seeking to be transformed in a small way. Lena joined them, her notebook closed, plans folded in. Lucas walked with them, the distance between mother and son softened. As they walked away from the mill, Mara felt the years coalescing in her bones, not as burden, but as a pattern of small, tenacious choices. She had set out to be seen, and, in doing so, had become a witness to a wider compassion. Elias had learned that protection without truth rots into tyranny. Lena had reclaimed a version of science that kept persons, not mere data, at the center. Lucas had found a way to love the mother he'd once thought eccentric. Behind them, the city continued, ignorant in the ways all living things are of the full map of their own making. But in small pockets, in basements and in lecture halls, on buses and in laundromats, people carried fragments of a story that refused to be entirely controlled. The creature remained in the world,
not as a trophy, but as a partner in an expanding, tentative conversation about what it meant to be human in the presence of other minds. There were costs, and there would be more costs. Lives had been broken and remade. Careers had been altered. But what they had done together in those months, what they had risked in the name of being seen and of being human, had shifted the orbit of something larger than themselves. Mara turned back once before they left the square and saw, in the distant windows of a building, a small group forming an impromptu choir. They sang the tune she had once taught the creature, voices slightly off-key and raw. It was not a grand psalm. It was the texture of ordinary people making noise together. It sounded like mercy. She walked on with Elias and Lena and Lucas, 3 imperfect witnesses, and the son who had finally learned to sit with his mother's truth. The night folded around them like a film reel closing, grain-filled and full of lingering light. They had not reclaimed everything. They had not made promises that everything would be easy. But they had done the hardest thing there is. They had let themselves be changed. And in that change was a fragile, fierce hope that some small human tenderness could survive systems built of erasure. As they reached the observatory gate, Mara paused and put her hand on the rusted metal. In the dome behind them, the creature turned as if aware of the shift, an odd, patient acknowledgement that whatever had been between them, years of music and film, of watching and being watched, had been witnessed. It was not the end of a story so much as the beginning of a long conversation. Mara smiled, a small knowing thing, and told herself, quietly, not as proclamation but as vow, that she would keep witnessing as long as there were ears left to hear and hands willing to learn to touch with gentleness. She would make sure that the public's memory of the creature was not one of fear, but of a lesson learned, that being seen is never simply about proof, but about the humility of accepting that some mysteries change us by asking us to be kinder. They stepped into the night together, 3 people and 1 son, moving toward a future none of them could predict, each bearing the scar and the gift of what they'd risked. Behind them, the dome held a light that flickered like an old film reel, faithful and insistently human. The observatory gate swung shut behind them with a small, final clunk that felt less like an ending and more like a punctuation mark in an ongoing sentence. Mara's palm lingered on rust. The metal vibrated faintly under her fingers, as if remembering the years it had held together. She turned toward the dome one last time before the night took them and saw the creature standing where it always had stood, not posed for spectacle, but waiting, patient, unhurried, its silhouette a question that had taught them how to listen. They walked slowly back toward town, a chorus of 3 and a son whose footsteps matched the uneven rhythm of a life reconciling itself. Conversation fell into comfortable gaps, small jokes, the awkward pauses of people used to auditing one another's wounds. Lena had a plan folder tucked under her arm, edges softened by travel and by her hand. Elias kept quiet until they reached the lamplight, and then, as if practicing, tried on a domestic word he had scarcely used in years. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was thin with something like repair. Mara nodded, not because his admission erased his actions, but because it opened a possibility, a new ledger that recorded remorse and the willingness to make different choices. "Help us keep it honest," she replied, "not just safe." Lucas walked between them and looked up at his mother. There was no headline or public vindication in his face, only the familiar tilt of his head that had always belonged to a boy assessing a story he half believed. "You were right," he said, and the sentence landed with the weight of a small, private truce. They set about the work of the new normal in ways that felt both bureaucratic and sacred. Lena met with community councils and drafted consent forms that read like promises. Elias staffed panels that invited citizens into oversight rather than shutting them out. Mara taught workshops in small theaters, showing frames and talking about witnessing as an ethical practice, about how film could be an act of care rather than domination. Sometimes, late into evenings, they would sit at the observatory table with thermoses and note cards and argue about framing. Which scenes honored the creature's agency? Which might be corrosive if stripped of context? The creature itself became the axis around which a ragged public ritual formed. Not exhibitions of containment, but rooms of listening. People brought songs and stories in carefully arranged visits where consent and time were the currencies. Children came with folded paper telescopes and brought snacks. Elders read poems aloud. Scientists came too, but they were paired with ethicists and artists, instructed to stay in a posture of learning. Contracts still appeared in the mail, polite and predatory, but the stewardship model they had forged made predation harder. Communities had a legal standing now, a chorus to push back. Months blurred like a reel played at half speed. There were setbacks, a leak here, an overzealous vendor there, but each was a lesson. They revised protocols, appealed court injunctions, and sometimes lost. Yet even in loss, the culture of witnessing grew, not as an institution, but as a dispersed practice. People in basements screening fragments, teachers using the footage to discuss responsibility, poets writing ekphrases about a hand that cupped a cassette player. One winter evening, Mara received a letter that had the awkward beauty of a thing from another era. A child's drawing of the creature clutching a camera, glued to stiff paper, signed with block letters, "Thank you." The envelope smelled faintly of crayons and the kitchen table the child had worked on. Mara held the drawing like a relic. She thought of the long arc from that first Super 8 frame to this scribbled gratitude and felt the fierce sweetness of a life not wasted. Elias's hearings came and went with the slow impartiality of civic machinery. He did not escape reproach, but a chorus of citizen testimonies, artists, archivists, and ordinary people who had been moved, tempered the consequences with a public conversation about ethics. Lena declined offers that would have turned the creature into a commodity. She chose instead to build an independent cooperative of researchers and community stewards who lived by the consent frameworks she had drafted. Mara found her rhythms shifted. She taught and curated and sometimes sat with the creature in silent watch, letting its attendance be a sermon on patience. She and Lucas rebuilt a tentative closeness around ordinary rituals, shared coffee, the lazy watching of old films, the awkward, pleasurable relearning of family jokes. They did not pretend the past was erased. They learned how to move with its shadow. On the first anniversary of the leak, the town organized a modest gathering at the observatory. People brought thermoses, blankets, and small lanterns. They projected a single reel onto a white sheet hung between two weathered oaks, the same sequence that had first pierced the world years before. As the frames flickered, the crowd was still. Children hummed the tune Mara had taught. Elders held one another's hands. When the final frame slipped into darkness, someone started a low, sustained clap that swelled into something like benediction. Mara stood beneath the dome afterward and watched the creature tilt its head toward the night sky. It raised one long hand, and for a moment the starlight seemed caught in the web of its fingers. She felt, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof and everything to do with the shape of her own heart, that being witnessed had changed them all. Not by giving neat answers, but by widening the space where tenderness could live. She had wanted to be seen. In learning to be a witness rather than an owner of truth, she had been given back something deeper, the ability to keep giving, film by film, song by song, the small, patient offerings that make a world kinder.